Good morning. Tonight we begin with a development that Pentagon officials, NATO intelligence analysts, and defense strategists across 4 continents had been monitoring, analyzing, and now are racing to respond to. A development that unfolded not over months of careful diplomacy, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that triggered emergency consultations inside the Kremlin. 72 hours that forced Russian military command to reassess their entire strategic position in Ukraine. 72 hours that revealed something Moscow had desperately tried to conceal. What satellite imagery captured this week crossed a threshold that Russian propaganda had insisted would never be reached. And when that threshold was crossed, Russia did not respond with the confidence we've seen in their state media. They responded with silence, repositioning, and what intelligence analysts are describing as defensive panic. Tonight, we're going to break down exactly what the data shows, why it matters strategically, and what it tells us about the trajectory of this conflict. Because what you're about to see isn't just another battlefield update. It's evidence of a fundamental shift in capability. For weeks now, there had been indicators. Not official statements from the White House, not formal announcements from European capitals, just indicators that something significant was being prepared. Open-source intelligence analysts who monitor military logistics know the patterns. The increase in satellite passes over specific regions. The unusual concentration of commercial imaging resources focused on Russian territory. The sudden uptick in encrypted military communications between Washington and allied capitals. The strategic repositioning of Ukrainian forces that didn't match typical defensive rotations. All of these indicators were present, and experienced OSINT analysts had learned to read them. But what set off analysis bells this week was that multiple streams of intelligence began converging on the same conclusion simultaneously. Satellite data, signals intelligence, commercial imaging, Ukrainian battlefield reports, all pointing to the same reality. Russia's equipment reserves were not infinite. They were measurable. They were declining. And the rate of that decline was accelerating. For months, Russian state media had maintained a narrative of unlimited military capacity. Endless reserves of tanks, artillery, armored vehicles stretching across storage facilities from the Urals to the Pacific. But that narrative, we now know from verifiable satellite evidence, was fundamentally misleading. Because while Moscow was broadcasting strength, commercial satellites were documenting reality. And that reality tells a very different story. The story of a military-industrial complex under unprecedented strain. The story of storage facilities being systematically emptied. The story of a Russian defense establishment that is cannibalizing its future to sustain its present. This isn't speculation. This isn't analysis based on Ukrainian claims or Western propaganda. This is data. Verifiable, independently confirmed satellite data from multiple commercial imaging providers. And that data reveals something Moscow cannot deny and cannot spin. Early this week, analysts at multiple OSINT organizations published findings based on satellite imagery spanning the last 6 months. What they documented was described as systematic depletion of Russian armored vehicle reserves at a rate that exceeds production capacity by a factor of 3 to 1. These are the kinds of findings that defense ministries only arrive at when they have access to comprehensive, time series satellite data. The kind of analysis that reveals not just what exists, but how quickly it's disappearing. According to imagery analysis from Maxar Technologies Planet Labs and independent OSINT researchers, Russian equipment storage facilities show a pattern that is unmistakable. Month-over-month decline in operational vehicle counts. Increasing presence of cannibalized hulls stripped for parts. Expansion of repair facilities that cannot keep pace with incoming damaged equipment. These indicators, when analyzed together, paint a picture of an industrial system under extraordinary pressure. The analysis, according to sources with access to the imagery, reveals several critical categories of depletion. Main battle tanks removed from storage at rates exceeding 200 per month. Infantry fighting vehicles showing similar depletion patterns with concentrations at facilities near the Ukrainian border. artillery systems being pulled from deep storage in Siberian facilities and transported westward, self-propelled howitzers showing the highest rate of attrition relative to remaining reserves. And most significantly, evidence that Russia is now accessing storage facilities that had been mothballed since the Soviet era, pulling equipment that hasn't been maintained in decades. That last indicator is what intelligence analysts call a strategic red line. When a military power begins accessing its deepest reserves, reserves that were intended as last resort national defense assets, it signals something critical about their current operational sustainability. Within hours of these findings being published, we began seeing Russian military bloggers, normally triumphant in their assessments, going unusually quiet. The typical narratives about unstoppable Russian production capacity were absent. The confident predictions about overwhelming Ukrainian defenses with superior numbers were muted. Something had shifted in the information space, and when Russian military bloggers go quiet, it means the data they're seeing internally matches what satellite imagery is revealing publicly. They can't credibly dispute what commercial satellites are documenting for the entire world to see. The imagery shows not just depletion, but the physical evidence of an industrial system struggling to maintain output. Repair facilities with backlogs of damaged vehicles waiting months for parts. Storage yards where tanks are being systematically stripped to provide components for other tanks. Transportation networks moving equipment from facilities thousands of kilometers away, indicating that closer reserves have been exhausted. This is not the profile of a military with unlimited sustainability. This is the profile of a force consuming its capital reserves at an unsustainable rate. The statement now circulating through defense analysis communities was not routine. It was not speculative. It was not based on Ukrainian military claims. It was based on independently verifiable satellite data that anyone with access to commercial imaging can confirm. Analyst after analyst, organization after organization reached the same conclusion. Russia's ground forces are operating on borrowed time. The equipment losses they've sustained over nearly 3 years of high-intensity conflict are not being replaced by production. They're being replaced by storage, and storage is finite. For months, Western defense officials had been cautious about making definitive statements regarding Russian industrial capacity. There were uncertainties about production rates, about hidden reserves, about the possibility that Russia had capabilities not visible to satellite observation. But satellite data, when analyzed systematically over sufficient time periods, eliminates many of those uncertainties. You cannot hide the systematic emptying of storage facilities that span hundreds of acres. You cannot conceal the movement of thousands of armored vehicles across rail networks. You cannot disguise the physical transformation of repair facilities overwhelmed with damaged equipment. Here's what the data reveals. Over the last 6 months, Russian equipment storage facilities have shown net reductions in main battle tank inventory, averaging 67 tanks per month per facility across the 12 largest storage sites. That's not speculation. That's measured depletion based on before and after satellite imagery with individual vehicles counted and categorized. Infantry fighting vehicle stocks have declined by approximately 400 units across monitored facilities in the same period. Artillery systems show similar patterns with the highest rates of removal from facilities in the Urals region, indicating that closer reserves in Western Russia have been substantially depleted. Self-propelled artillery, which has seen particularly heavy attrition in Ukraine due to counter-battery fire, shows depletion rates that exceed all other categories. These aren't estimates. These are counts based on satellite imagery, analyzed by multiple independent organizations, reaching consistent conclusions. The speed and scale of this depletion tells us something important about Russian strategic calculations. Moscow's military planners had clearly anticipated a much shorter conflict. The rate at which they're consuming equipment reserves suggests they expected to achieve decisive battlefield results before these reserves became critically depleted. But that decisive result hasn't materialized. Ukrainian resistance hasn't collapsed. Western support hasn't evaporated. And now Russia finds itself in a position it hadn't planned for. Fighting a protracted high-intensity conflict while consuming reserves faster than industry can replace them. This is what strategists call an unsustainable operational tempo. It's the military equivalent of running a marathon at sprint pace. You can maintain it for a while, but physics eventually asserts itself. Tonight, we're seeing the physics of industrial warfare asserting itself on Russian military capacity. Intelligence analysts monitoring these developments describe what's happening as a strategic inflection point. Not because Russia is about to run out of equipment tomorrow, but because the trajectory is now clear and the end point is calculable. At current attrition rates and current production rates, Russian ground forces will face critical equipment shortages in specific categories within 12 to 18 months. That timeline assumes Russia maintains current offensive operational tempo. If they increase operations, the timeline compresses. If they reduce operations, it extends. But the fundamental dynamic doesn't change. They are consuming capital faster than they're generating income. And eventually, that equation resolves itself. The only question is when. Moscow understands this mathematics as well as Western analysts do, which is why we're seeing what we're seeing. The sudden interest in negotiated settlements. The renewed diplomatic outreach to non-Western powers. The propaganda emphasis shifting from inevitable victory to heroic resistance against Western aggression. These are the signs of a power that understands its strategic position is eroding and is searching for ways to lock in gains before erosion becomes collapse. But here's where the strategic picture becomes even more complex. Ukraine, with increasing Western support, is not static. They're not waiting for Russian equipment to run out. They're actively accelerating the depletion through increasingly sophisticated combined arms operations. The strikes we've seen over recent weeks, targeting Russian logistics hubs, ammunition depots, repair facilities, these aren't random. These are systematic efforts to increase the rate at which Russia must consume reserves. Every ammunition depot destroyed means Russia must transport ammunition from farther away, consuming fuel and transport capacity. Every repair facility hit means damaged vehicles take longer to return to service, increasing the rate at which Russia must pull from storage. Every logistics hub disrupted means supply chains become less efficient, forcing Russia to maintain larger reserve stocks closer to the front. Ukraine is fighting an industrial war as much as a military one, and they're doing it with increasing effectiveness. The implications of this reality extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. If Russia cannot sustain its current operational tempo indefinitely, then every month that passes without achieving decisive results weakens their strategic position. Time, which Moscow believed was on their side, may actually be working against them. Ukrainian forces are being trained on increasingly sophisticated Western equipment. Ukrainian industrial capacity is being supported by Western production. Ukrainian tactical competence is increasing through combat experience. Meanwhile, Russian forces are consuming irreplaceable Soviet-era equipment reserves, suffering personnel casualties they cannot easily replace, and operating under sanctions that constrain their ability to reconstitute depleted stocks. This is not a sustainable dynamic for Moscow, and they know it. Tonight, multiple OSINT sources have documented that Russia has begun accessing storage facilities in the Far East that had been considered strategic reserves for potential Pacific theater contingencies. Moving equipment from these facilities to the Ukrainian theater is a decision that carries enormous strategic implications. It means Moscow has made a calculation that the immediate threat in Ukraine supersedes the need to maintain ready reserves for other potential contingencies. That's a significant admission of strategic pressure. When a military power begins stripping resources from one theater to sustain operations in another, it reveals constraints that propaganda cannot conceal. It reveals a military establishment making difficult choices between competing priorities. And those choices tell adversaries and allies alike something about the true state of Russian military capacity. What makes this moment particularly critical is that these developments are occurring while Russia faces other significant strategic pressures. Economic sanctions are limiting access to advanced components needed for precision weapons production. Demographic constraints are making large-scale mobilization politically difficult. International isolation is restricting access to dual-use technologies that modern militaries require. Military-industrial facilities are struggling with labor shortages as workers flee mobilization or seek better opportunities elsewhere. These pressures compound. Sanctions make it harder to produce replacements for depleted equipment. Demographic constraints make it harder to crew the equipment they do have. Isolation makes it harder to acquire the technology needed to modernize declining systems. None of these pressures individually would be decisive, but together, they create a strategic environment where Russia's margin for error is shrinking, and shrinking margins lead to difficult decisions. The kind of decisions we're now seeing evidence of in satellite imagery and battlefield developments. President Zelensky addressed these realities in recent statements, noting that Ukraine's strategy is not simply to hold territory, but to systematically degrade Russia's capacity to sustain offensive operations. He said that every Russian tank destroyed is one they cannot fully replace. He said that every logistics hub struck is one that cannot easily be rebuilt under current sanctions. He said that time and industrial mathematics are now working in Ukraine's favor and that Russia's window for achieving military objectives is closing. These aren't empty rhetorical claims. These are statements grounded in the same satellite data and industrial analysis that Western defense establishments are reviewing. Zelensky has access to NATO intelligence. He understands the same equipment depletion data that we're discussing, and his confidence reflects an understanding that the strategic balance is shifting in ways that favor patience and systematic degradation over desperate breakthrough attempts. But here's what makes the current situation so delicate. A Russia facing declining capability is not necessarily a less dangerous Russia. Powers in strategic decline sometimes take desperate actions to reverse unfavorable trends. The concern among Western intelligence communities is that, as Moscow's conventional options narrow, the temptation to escalate in other domains might increase. This is why the coming months require careful management. Ukraine needs to continue applying military pressure to accelerate Russian equipment depletion. The West needs to continue providing support that enables that pressure. But all parties need to manage escalation risks carefully as Russia's strategic position becomes more constrained. Declining powers with nuclear weapons require different handling than declining powers without them. And that reality shapes every calculation that Washington, Brussels, and Kiev are making. What we're witnessing now is the intersection of military operations and industrial capacity playing out in real time. Russia's initial invasion assumed a short war that wouldn't strain industrial reserves. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Now they're fighting the war their industrial base isn't designed to sustain indefinitely. Ukraine, meanwhile, is fighting exactly the kind of war their Western backing enables. A war of systematic attrition, a war where industrial sustainability matters as much as battlefield tactics. A war where time becomes a weapon if you have the capacity to outlast your opponent. The satellite data emerging this week suggests that capacity is shifting, that Russia's ability to sustain current operations indefinitely is not assured, that their equipment reserves, while still substantial, are not infinite, and that the mathematics of attrition are beginning to assert themselves in ways that will shape strategic calculations for both sides. The coming weeks will reveal how Moscow responds to these realities. Do they attempt to accelerate operations to achieve results before depletion becomes critical? Do they reduce operational tempo to extend sustainability? Do they pursue diplomatic solutions that lock in territorial gains? Do they escalate in non-conventional domains to change the strategic equation? Each option carries risks. Each option has implications for how this conflict evolves. But all options must now be considered against the backdrop of a verified reality. Russian equipment reserves are depleting faster than production can replace them. That's not propaganda. That's not Ukrainian military claims. That's satellite data independently verified by multiple commercial providers and analyzed by organizations with no stake in the outcome. And data, unlike rhetoric, is difficult to dispute. Tonight, Defense analysts monitoring Russian military logistics report increased activity at rail hubs connecting Far Eastern storage facilities to Western transportation networks. They report expansion of repair facilities beyond normal capacity, indicating backlogs. They report evidence of equipment cannibalization at rates consistent with parts shortages. And they report that Russia's decision to access strategic Far East reserves represents a significant strategic indicator that nearer reserves are substantially depleted. These indicators, when combined with satellite imagery of storage facilities, paint a picture that is difficult to misinterpret. Russia is under industrial strain. Their equipment reserves are finite, and the rate of depletion suggests they have a limited window to achieve objectives before capability constraints force difficult strategic choices. Ukraine is not waiting passively for that window to close. Their operations over recent months have specifically targeted the infrastructure that Russia needs to sustain equipment flow to the front. Railways, bridges, logistics hubs, ammunition storage, repair facilities. Every successful strike against these targets accelerates the rate at which Russia must consume reserves. It's industrial warfare conducted through military means, and it's proving increasingly effective. The precision with which Ukraine is conducting these operations tells us something about the intelligence support they're receiving. These aren't random strikes. These are target selections based on sophisticated analysis of Russian logistics networks. That level of targeting requires the kind of intelligence that only comes from satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and detailed understanding of how Russian military logistics function. It requires the kind of support that NATO provides. And it's having measurable effects on Russian operational capacity. Remember, Russia planned for a short war. Their initial invasion force was designed for rapid, decisive operations, not sustained, high-intensity conflict. Their logistics were configured for deep penetration, followed by consolidation, not static defensive operations consuming massive amounts of ammunition daily. Their industrial planning assumed victory before reserves needed replenishment, not 3 years of grinding attrition. Every assumption underlying their initial invasion has been invalidated by reality. And now they're fighting a war their military wasn't designed for, with an industrial base that isn't configured to sustain it indefinitely. That's not a position of strength. That's a position that generates strategic vulnerability. And strategic vulnerability creates options for adversaries. What makes this development so strategically significant is that it's happening while other pressures on Russia are intensifying. Western sanctions continue limiting access to advanced components. Ukrainian strikes continue degrading military-industrial facilities. International isolation continues restricting technology transfer. Demographic pressures continue making mobilization difficult. Economic strains continue forcing difficult budget choices. None of these individually would be decisive, but together, they create compounding pressures that narrow Moscow's strategic options. A Russia with unlimited equipment and unlimited personnel and unlimited economic resources could sustain current operations indefinitely. But Russia doesn't have unlimited anything. They have finite reserves being consumed at measurable rates. And those rates, based on current satellite data, suggest sustainability horizons that are calculable. That changes strategic calculations on all sides. The next phase of this conflict will be shaped by these industrial realities as much as by battlefield tactics. Russia needs to achieve results before equipment constraints force operational reductions. Ukraine needs to sustain operations long enough for those constraints to manifest. The West needs to provide support that enables Ukrainian sustainability while managing escalation risks. All of these objectives are now being pursued against a backdrop of verified data about Russian equipment depletion. Data that suggests time may be shifting in Ukraine's favor. Data that suggests Russia's window for achieving maximalist objectives is narrowing. Data that suggests industrial mathematics may prove more decisive than battlefield heroics. This is the reality that satellite imagery is revealing. This is the strategic context that shapes current military operations. And this is why the coming months will be critical for determining how this conflict ultimately resolves. As reports continue emerging from defense analysis communities, we're learning more about the scale of Russian industrial strain, equipment production rates that cannot match attrition rates, repair facilities with month-long backlogs, storage facilities being emptied systematically across Western Russia, Far Eastern reserves being accessed despite strategic risks elsewhere. These are not indicators of a military with sustainable, indefinite operational capacity. These are indicators of a military consuming capital reserves to sustain current operations. And capital reserves, by definition, are finite. What happens when they approach depletion will define the next phase of this conflict. But that they are depleting is no longer in serious dispute. The satellite data is too clear. The pattern is too consistent. The trajectory is too obvious. What happens next depends on decisions being made in Moscow, Kyiv, Washington, and Brussels. But those decisions are now being made with knowledge of a fundamental reality. Russia cannot sustain current operations indefinitely without industrial changes that current sanctions make difficult. Time is no longer clearly on Moscow's side. The mathematics of attrition are asserting themselves, and satellite imagery is documenting the results for the world to see. That's not speculation. That's not propaganda. That's data. And data ultimately is what shapes strategic reality. Tonight, that data tells a clear story. A story of depletion, strain, and narrowing options. A story that will shape how this conflict unfolds in the critical months ahead. And we'll be here analyzing every development as this strategic reality continues to unfold. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe for continuing coverage of these developments. Share this with anyone who needs to understand the industrial dynamics shaping this conflict. And comment below with your analysis of what Russia's next strategic move might be given these equipment constraints. The data is clear, the implications are significant, and the next phase begins now.